So my role today here, first of all, of course, thank you for having me, is to provide a general introduction to the role of public procurement and circular economy within the context of, let's say, a broader context of climate change policies. Just as a disclaimer, I'm neither an expert in public procurement nor a mastermind in circular economy as such, as my expertise is more focused on climate change, law and regulation. So hopefully what I will give you today is, let's say, a different perspective of the role that these two fundamental concepts, or let's say mechanisms, can provide within the general framework of the commitments and the strive, let's say, that the European Union collectively, as well as globally, must be undertaken to, of course, to tackle climate change within the broader, let's say, policy context. So let me give you a brief overview of the agenda here. So I will just quickly set the stage, so give you some, let's say, metrics to understand exactly where we stand and therefore where public procurement and circular economy, really features, let's say, the general context for the fight against climate change. I will then move a little bit into the legal circle that must be squared, as far as I can tell, with regard, again, to the role of public procurement and circular economy. And then I will try to distill some concepts that I find very interesting as related to life cycle thinking, to embedding life cycle thinking in the current policies that actually can support the fight against climate change, especially from an energy perspective, and draw some conclusions. Let's say, from my perspective, in order to foster and enhance the current framework and to better embed the potential of public procurement and circular economy in the context of climate change policies. So the first slide here, I just wanted to have a little bit of a breakdown of the greenhouse gases emissions in the EU. You can see on the left-hand side the breakdown for 2019. I will not talk about 2020, which is of course a peculiar year, as you can all imagine. As I see, 2019 gives a little bit of a better baseline of where we stand in terms of greenhouse gases emissions. You see clearly that the industrial sector and the agricultural sector are still quite meaningful, as well, of course, transport and energy supply in terms of share of greenhouse gases emissions in the EU27, of course, not accounting for the UK. These data are in terms of tons of CO2. And you can see on the right-hand side where we should be going, let's say, to achieve the long-term strategy which the European Commission has set itself, and based on which both the next national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement would be drafted, and also, of course, the European climate law, let's say, has been adopted, and the Green Deal as well. You can see that the trajectory is quite steep, especially with regard to emission reductions in the energy sector, including also, of course, agricultural activities and the industry. You see the blue, let's say, share of the graph on the right-hand side. I will definitely, let's say, zoom in on the industrial sector and the energy sector, as well as to some extent on the agricultural sector, because those sectors, as you will see in the next slide, are definitely the most important, also with regard to the role that circular economy can play, and I think also to some extent the public procurement can play with regard to the fight against greenhouse gases emissions. You see, therefore, that the pathway ahead is very cumbersome. It includes, by the way, some net emissions. So in terms of offsetting greenhouse gases emission that we cannot possibly, let's say, take away, even if we do reach climate neutrality by 2050, as it is envisaged within the European Union. Against this background, there is another side of the story, and this is where also public procurement, I think, comes into place in a relevant way. The issue of investing. You can see also these two graphs that I took from the long-term strategy, by the European Commission, so nothing that I made up, it's just official information here. You see the additional annual investments that are needed to achieve both the well below 2 degrees, let's say, threshold that is set in the Paris Agreement, and on the red line in the left-hand side graph, the 1.5 degrees scenario, which is the optimal scenario envisaged under the Paris Agreement. We need something around 300 billion euros, let's say, to the very optimistic scenario in the EU to achieve indeed that pathway that I showed you in the previous slide. Of course, we can do less than that. We can stick with the, let's say, conservative scenario, or we can fall somewhere in between. But I think that, of course, the European Commission is very much striving to achieve, of course, the, let's say, more ambitious end of the spectrum. So you see a lot of money involved. And to do that, of course, there are a lot of elements that come into play. Among all of them, as you can see on the right-hand side, of course, I would like to strive the role of EU budget, the role, of course, of sustainable finance, which is a whole different, let's say, part of the story. But definitely the role of national and EU budgets in this respect are key. And as you can see also in this slide, the role of circular economy in terms of rolling out technologies and decarbonizing value chains. So really very much reducing greenhouse gases throughout the value chains in different sectors. So this is a little bit in a very nutshell, of course, since we don't have so much time to delve into details, let's say the background in which the European Union operates. And this is where I think both public procurement and circular economy are very much key. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. Okay, now I would like to look at this slide because I think it is very important to better understand where we are. This is, of course, aggregated data, not really, let's say, globally. So they are not looking at the EU itself, but it gives you a perspective of where we stand in terms of implementing circular economy. So where do we stand there? If you look at, again, the left-hand side, you have, let's say, the upstream source of greenhouse gases emissions. So in terms of materials, of minerals, of course, fossil fuels that are used for produce energy and energy, so electricity and heat, essentially, biomass and waste. In total, we have embodied greenhouse gases emissions, meaning greenhouse gases emissions that come from all these sources throughout, let's say, the whole value chain, equaling 59.1 gigatons in 2019. This is, of course, again, global data that are broken down in different, let's say, in different outputs to society, as you can see on the right-hand side, in terms of, again, services, mobility, consumables, so the very clothes we use, nutrition, so the food chain, and so on. What I think it is very much important to bear in mind here when we talk about implementing circular thinking here, regardless of the definition, which is a problem that I will address in a few minutes, is indeed the process whereby we have a shift from, let's say, the process step throughout this chain. If you look at above, you have process, produce, provide, which literally goes through the whole value chain. If you look at the passage from process to produce and provide, you have a total switch from the emissions that come, the embodied emissions that come from the energy carriers, like fossil fuels, to some extent renewable energy, and the materials. So for example, if you look at very much the process step of the chain, you have a ratio that is basically 70% embodied emissions from energy sources and 30% from minerals. If you go down the line to the produce and provide steps, so literally down the transformation chain, the ratio completely reverses. So in the end, what we have at the very end of the transformation chain, that materials and minerals account for more or less 70% of greenhouse gases emissions, as opposed to the 30% that are related to the emissions that come from energy sources. So from essentially fossil fuels or other sources of energy like nuclear or renewable energy. So this boils down to the point that where we have to act in terms of very much enacting circularity and very much reducing the embodied greenhouse gas emissions that come throughout value chain are indeed to be seen and to be identified in the process of transformation. We need to very much focus on those steps of the chain. So in this graph, from process to provide, let's say, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions there. This, of course, will have some, let's say, cascade effects that, of course, will also reduce the energy inputs that we need to go down the line to the right-hand side of the spectrum. There is a gap, and of course, this graph was taken indeed from the Circularity Gap Report, which if you haven't done so, I strongly suggest to take a look at. There is a gap where circularity can really play a role. And in this respect, I would like to translate the previous graph into this graph, which really relates, let's say, the gap we have in the implementation of circular economy policies, also for public procurement, and the Paris Agreement goals. If we stick with the business as usual scenario that we have without the policies that we have adopted or at least pledged to adopt under the Paris Agreement, we will definitely end up in a world we don't want to live in. So if we stick with the business as usual, again, 59.1 billion tons of CO2 globally in 2019, well, with the business as usual, we will reach a 65 billion tons CO2 emitted in 2030. Actually, to get to the 1.5 scenario, which is again the optimal scenario under the Paris Agreement, we will need to keep it down to 39 billion tons CO2. So we have around 26 billion tons globally CO2 gap to fill. And how do we do that? Well, of course, we can do that through some measures, which are, of course, upscaling renewable energy, energy efficiency, reforestation, rendering our agricultural processes more sustainable and less impactful in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But it has been, let's say, appraised that actually at 10 to 11, let's say 11 billion tons CO2 in this gap can be indeed filled by implementing a true circular economy approach. So sharing and service models, circular design, well, recovery and reuse of materials. So acting on that parcel of the value chain that I highlighted before. But the gap is still there. So of course the EU is trying to move forward to let's say to fill this gap. However, I do believe that there are still some let's say steps to be taken to really make sure that not only globally but also at the EU level this gap can be filled throughout due implementation and proper implementation. So this is also relevant for the SDGs, of course. Probably nothing new here. Of course, SDG number 12 is the most relevant, but at the same time, of course, it embeds a lot of other SDGs throughout as long as, of course, it relates to the whole value chain. Of course, it relates to climate action. It relates to providing better food and more available for more people, thus reducing hunger and increasing global health and well-being. It is also relevant, of course, to enhance sustainable cities and communities as, let's say, more sustainable systems and more sustainable, let's say, arrangements are taken also at the municipal level, where, of course, most of the population lives, especially in developed countries. There is also, of course, the issue of enhancing industry innovation, and this was already mentioned before, and ensure economic growth through, let's say, also decent work conditions. So all these things come together and are borne in mind, at least in theory, also at the European Union level, of course, because as we all know, the EU is not only bound, let's say, by the Paris Agreement objectives and commitments, but also due to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Just wanted to clarify also this aspect, because this is also relevant in driving the legislation that is being adopted in the context of EU climate and energy policy, which, at least to my knowledge, is very little, let's say, geared to the public procurement framework, which again I'm not very much knowledgeable about, but this is what I can tell. What I can tell here is that all these documents that you see in these slides are relevant for, let's say, from the perspective, of course, of the EU energy and climate framework. We have the not yet adopted environmental action plan, which is again a planning document, not binding per se, but it really drives the way through, and it tells you that indeed there must be a focus on regenerative growth model and on reduction of production and consumption as regards climate change pressures. This works in combination, of course, with the European Green Deal, which as such is a communication by the Commission, and as such is a kind of Pandora's box where you would like to have a lot of measures to be adopted. But again, here the focus on fostering innovation, the focus on spending public budgets in, let's say, towards low carbon solutions and towards achieving climate neutrality is, of course, key here. Of course, there is a lot of we can say about it to unpack the European Green Deal, but I'm afraid we don't have so much, enough time to do that now. But it is important to note that the European Green Deal, nevertheless, very much is, let's say, a channel or aims to channel all the efforts, not only at the EU level, but also through national budgets, to very much implement, let's say, the objectives that are set by the Paris Agreement, among other things. There is, of course, the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, as we boil down to the issue of circular economy, which you all know about probably. In this respect, I highlighted two reforms that are to be undertaken by the EU, which I think are important in terms of, again, enhancing a true circular approach to materials transformation, for example, so sustainability principles and standards for products, the reform of the eco-design framework. This is also very much important, I think, in terms of embedding a life cycle thinking in throughout the value chain in the EU. We have then the whole new governance system that is binding now upon member states. We have the EU climate law, very much new baby, the law of the laws, as Franz Timmermans said, that mandates now binding greenhouse gases emission reduction targets collectively in the EU, 55% by 2030, and of course, climate neutrality by 2050, minus 55%, of course. And the new governance framework that is set both under the EU climate law and the energy governance regulation that mandates national energy and climate plans. So these national energy and climate plans, as you all probably know, must basically showcase all the measures that member states are to adopt to collectively achieve the greenhouse gases collective emission targets at the EU level. And these plans are validated by the European Commission. So it is now, let's say, in place a governance system whereby the European Commission has more pervasive powers as to the actual, let's say, solutions that member states should or should not adopt to fight climate change. I would also like to highlight that through the EU climate law, it is envisaged that the European Commission can set sector-specific greenhouse gases emission trajectories for specific sectors, so for example, for the industry sector, to achieve climate neutrality. We will see how this will work out in practice, but this is, I think, an interesting development because it really shows the Commission is intended to address, let's say, go to the very much down the line with regard to addressing emissions from specific sectors. And this is also relevant, I think, in terms of, again, driving, let's say, public and private expenditures towards emission reduction in specific sectors throughout different value chains. We have, of course, the EU emission trading system, which is already let's say, a market-based instrument, is also putting already pressure on certain industrial sector to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, albeit towards, let's say, again, a cap and trade system. So very much leaving it to the market to some extent. And we have, of course, still in place the effort sharing regulation that addresses sectors that are not covered by the EU ETS. And in this regard, I think the waste sector, the agricultural sector, the transport sector are very much relevant in this regard. So it sets binding emission targets through 2030 for each member state in those sectors. Of course, there are a lot of developments going on with regard, for example, for some sectors that are being embedded in the EU ETS. But this is, of course, an ongoing discussion that I don't want to touch upon today. Quickly, on the public procurement side of it, I would like to stress two norms that I think are important here, or two articles in both Directive on Public Procurement and Directive on Public Procurement operating in water, energy, transport, and postal services. We have Articles 16 and 67, and 68 of the Directive 24, which are relevant, I think, in terms of embedding, let's say, circular thinking and the fight against climate change in the public procurement framework, as long as they mandate for the inclusion of social and environmental goals in the let's say, approach to public procurement. At the same time, we have Articles 82 and Article 82, 83 in Directive 25 that basically not only, again, embed social and environmental goals in the public procurement process, but also include the concept of life cycle costing. Actually, to be totally precise, Article 68 and 83 do that for both directives. So indeed include the concept of life cycle costing, and Article 67 and 82 very much try to drive public authorities, let's say, activities towards embedding environmental and social goals. These are norms, let's say, that are important as such. However, I think there are still gaps that I would like to highlight in the following slide. Of course, we have priorities that are set, the guidance on green and social procurement that must be enacted by the EU, and we have this in this key strategy document, making public procurement work in and for Europe. And we have ongoing reforms that I mentioned. Minimum mandatory green public procurement criteria and targets in sectoral legislation, the introduction of compulsory monitoring for the implementation of green public procurement. I think also important to note the fourth point here. So the reform of the BAT references, so best available technology references, to introduce circular economy considerations. BAT is quite an important command and control tool to reduce also greenhouse gas emission. And these are all, let's say, elements that are being taken into account and into consideration by the European Commission. And I think in this respect, to both, let's say, step up the role of green public procurement and circular economy these are important, let's say, novelties that the European Commission would like to introduce. However, there are, let's say, blind spots. And this was highlighted also by the European Parliament, by the IMCO committee briefing paper last year. 4 main pitfalls with regard specifically to public procurement, also with regard to the introduction of circular economy thinking. First of all, the lack of policy framework and clarity. So the risk of, let's say, conflicts between the introduction and the application of green public procurement and the single market, the lack of a definition of circular economy, which I think is quite a discussion that will be undertaken here in this very training session, as well as elsewhere, and the lack of awareness of the role of circular economy and public procurement within the broader context of environmental and climate policies. At the same time, we have market, financial, and technical barriers. Of course, the impact of taxes and regulation on private actors as an additional burden on producers through higher standards for green public procurement, for example. The lack of a flexibility in annual budgets at the national level, and the lack of a life cycle thinking approach and coordination in public procurement approaches. These are more financial and accounting barriers that also boil down to the lack of technical and administrative capacity. Also in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification, and also, again, the lack of capability to share green practices, enhance capacity buildings, and also poor knowledge on how supply chains actually work. So actually how you want to act on in a pointed way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure, let's say, that green public procurement standards are duly adopted. So in this respect, and coming down to the lack of life cycle thinking approach, I would like just to introduce you in a couple of minutes to a concept which I find very interesting, which is a concept of energy return on energy investment. I think that concepts that are really embedding, let's say, a life cycle thinking approach, and this concept relates to energy relationship between energy inputs and energy outputs, should be better embedded in the policy field. What is EROI? Again, EROI can be summarized as such, as you can see in the slide. The ratio between the energy that is returned to society throughout a given process to produce, for example, a good or to provide a service, and the energy that is required to get that energy. It is merely a net energy, let's say, relationship. So you take the input, which is a certain amount of joule, and you take the output. It, of course, has to do with how efficient are our value chains throughout the process. So coming back to the graph that I showed you before, from, let's say, the embodied greenhouse gas emissions upstream and downstream. It can be interpreted also in a very extended way. So it can be interpreted as much as, let's say, including the energy that is required to get, deliver, and use the energy that is actually returned to society. So just to give you an example of this, this is the process that actually relates to EROI. So you have, of course, a process that flows from raw materials to the production of a good, for example, and the production, of course, of waste that should be also recycled. So this should also, of course, entail the use of energy. And you have energy that is used throughout the process. This energy, of course, generates CO2. We have seen that before also in graphical terms quite clearly. But what is lacking now is really, let's say, a metrics that can appraise how effective we can be in terms of lowering this ratio, in terms of making sure that the energy we use upstream, as you can see on the left-hand side of this graph, so the input that comes from both production and importation, are very much, let's say, the gap that we have downstream when we have outputs of energy for final consumption and also for production of goods and so on, is reduced to the maximum extent possible. Because, of course, the more energy we waste, the more greenhouse gas emissions we emit, and the less efficient the whole process is. This has to do with implementing circular economy, in my perspective, at least from an energy standpoint. This is taken from Eurostat, and this is basically where the flow of energy in the EU. So where the energy comes from different sources, how it is transformed, and how it is, let's say, provided to society as a final output. And as you can see, of course, I'm not talking about the different shares here. Of course, renewable energy is still lagging behind to some extent. We want to have a larger green bar here. But what matters is that, as you can see here, the share of energy that is actually available for final consumption, it is very thin, it is very low as compared to the actual input. We have losses, of course, throughout the process. Not only, of course, losses that we can avoid, for instance, losses for, let's say, distribution and transmission and so on. But in the end, the problem lies, again, in the process of transformation, which is not effective enough. And from energy perspective, it is totally not sustainable. It is totally not also, in a way, circular. The concept of the ROI can be explained here, and it's been developed by hard sciences, let's say, especially with regard to fuels, of course. So you can see that it can be quite interpreted quite extensively in the context of fuels, for example, literally from the cradle to the gate, or from the well to the tank, to understand exactly how much energy is used to go from the extraction, for instance, of fossil fuel, or for the generation of renewable energy, literally from the installation of a solar panel down to the use, to the consumption of energy. Of course, including all the losses. This, I think, Now it has come to a very, let's say, developed stage. So calculations of EROI are quite sophisticated, and also allow us to understand how much sustainable is our lifestyle. You can see here two scenarios where we have a low EROI economy, so an economy that is actually not, let's say, not efficient in this respect, because the EROI ratio, of course, the lower it is, the less efficient it is in terms of the energy output and input, as compared to a high EROI economy where we have indeed, let's say, less losses of energy, and the rationale behind input and output is more efficient again, and we have less losses of energy down the process. You have, of course, more energy delivered to society and a lower amount of energy that is wasted. Of course, I'm not going to details into that, but I just want to point out that these can also be framed in terms of how impactful are inputs and outputs of energy in terms of greenhouse gases emission. Literature has also elaborated on this concept and has very much factored the EROI ratio, with also the carbon emission factor of different fuels, for example. So we can really understand throughout the process how much impact, both in terms of net energy relationship and also in terms of greenhouse gases emissions, has to use different sources of energy throughout a given process. This also, I think, it is an important driver of policies for European climate and energy in general, because it really tells you where you should go in order to reduce embodied, let's say, energy and also embodied greenhouse gases emissions throughout different production chains and transformation chains. So in this respect, of course, let's say, these data clearly show that, for example, coal is not energy efficient anymore, or is not EROI, let's say, convenient anymore from this perspective, as well as, for instance, tar sands, which is not a deal in the EU, but it is indeed elsewhere, and natural gas. Natural gas is also an energy carrier that is not, let's say, also convenient, not too much convenient, let's say, from the perspective of a net energy perspective, and also a net energy perspective is combined with greenhouse gases emissions. This really tells you, of course, that we should strive to implement renewable energy, and we should strive to implement, if possible, also carbon capture and sequestration to render these processes also more sustainable, but to an extent that will not allow us to waste primary energy at the source. These, I think, are key concepts to really reduce greenhouse gases emissions down the value chain, while, of course, focusing on reducing our footprint and our impact as consumers. And this is also where public procurement can play a role. There are several important impacts that I can foresee for this concept as it relates to embodied energy, embodied greenhouse gases emissions, of course, in different fields of EU climate and energy law. I don't want to go too much into details into that. Of course, what I would like to focus here is, of course, let's say, the relevance of permitting, for example. So when evaluating different projects, of course, the embodied energy and embodied greenhouse gases emissions are relevant, but are not too much taken into account yet in the relevant legislation. It should be included in the ETS, so in the emission trading system, also in terms of financing and driving, let's say, innovation in certain value chains and in certain industrial sectors. And of course, it can play a role in the public procurement sphere, as long as, of course, the concept of net energy and the concept of how much energy you need to run a certain process should also drive, I think, let's say, the adjudication of certain tenders, and should be included also within the broader context, the broader, let's say, box of the green public procurement standards. These are concepts that, to my knowledge, are little explored, as much as, of course, it is the focus lies on carbon intensity, which is fine, but nevertheless, it doesn't really focus on the energy, again, relationship between energy inputs and outputs to society. So to wrap up, 6 action points here that I could also find as key takeaways. Well, on the one hand, we need to strengthen governance framework to both enhance the role of public procurement in low carbon technology and also, of course, to embed circular economy. Circular economy is not very embedded into, for example, national climate pledges under the Paris Agreement. And let's say not very often also public procurement are indeed included in this. We need new carbon metrics on a sector-based approach on top of what is already been developed by UNFCCC and IPCC. And for example, a ROI can be one of the metrics that can be used to really embody, to really, let's say, adopt a life cycle thinking. And of course, we also need to improve our understanding and our, let's say, knowledge sharing in terms of how circular economy and public procurement can contribute to a fight against climate change. Climate plans are not integrated in this respect. And I found it very, very surprising, let's say, to see that indeed there are a lot of commitments and there are a lot of pledges, but when it comes down to some key concepts as circular economy and public procurement as a key, let's say, tool to deliver public expenses toward low carbon innovation, where there is not a lot going on in the international sphere. And this is also why I think we need to create an enabling environment to facilitate the circular transition. We need coalitions. The Procura Plus network, for example, is an example of that. But internationally, there are little efforts to establish, let's say, international coalition to boost capability, to prompt collective action towards circularity, and also to make companies more aware of circular business opportunities. There are market barriers. There are risks of lock-in of technologies, and therefore, both governments that lack technical capacity and companies that might face market and financial barriers should be more aware and, of course, to some extent prompted to very much embrace certain, let's say, thinking even before business models. And then, of course, there are reforms that have to be taken as respect to market-based system, to public procurement law, as I try to sketch out, and also even to tax system that are also that might, let's say, weight off in relation to the full implementation of a circular thinking and an effective green public procurement strategy. Of course, there are also other, let's say, arrangements that can be made more in detail. The mandatory green public procurement standards are one of them, longer awaited. But these are, let's say, to my knowledge and in my view, 6 key roadmap points that must drive the way forward in the EU, but not only in the EU, also collectively, if we want to fill out the gap that I highlighted in the beginning of this presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope I managed more or less the time. So I will just leave it there. And of course, I'm all yours if you have any questions. So thank you very much for your attention. I will try to stop sharing and get back to you, Steven, in Hasselt.
Thank you, Matteo. Yeah, now it's my turn, apparently. You have a question? What's your question? Matteo, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here, although I will have to jump to a project meeting, as you know. So, but I can take some extra 5 minutes if there are any compelling questions, or I can jump in later on.
Yeah, come here for the question. That's more convenient. Only one question today.
Nice to meet you. I am Natalia, working on the ESR project now, linked with the international trade and sustainable procurement. Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. So currently I'm working on my PhD chapter, like very fundamental of procurement and sustainability aspects. And I met the practical issue of application of the sustainable procurement in practice. And specifically, I'd like to ask you, how do you see, if you consider sustainability one of the procurement principles, how do you see it coexisting with the principle of competition and market efficiency? Because, well, if you got my point, I don't think I need to explain more, or if you need.
Well, no, I totally got your point, and of course, I touched this upon very briefly. This is a concern that is there in the EU. How you want to reconcile, let's say, the stepping up and the boosting of sustainability in public procurement and internal market constraints.
Exactly.
This is stressed by the European Parliament. I think that report is very much enlightening. It is, of course, it is not, it is a little bit off the radar, but these are reports that actually go very much into the problems, let's say, hit the problems. And well, I would say it is a very hard question to answer. I mean, from my perspective, I'm not a competition lawyer. So I would say the message, let's say, both political and to some extent, I think also, let's say, regulatory messages, let's say, that the European Commission is conveying is that, well, we care about competition, but of course, we also have other objects. So in the EU, I think the European Commission would more and more, let's say, steer competition law, state aid rules, for example, which again, I don't want to delve into details, but this is happening, in order to, let's say, have environmental objectives prevailing. So for example, in the EU, I would say that, of course, any, let's say, future, I put it in a very simple way, but any competition test that would face a certain measure adopted by a member state to enhance sustainability in public procurement probably would withstand tests that in the past it would not have withstood. Because I think here, I mean, from my perspective, my take is I understand the needs for competition, but I also understand that we have a strive towards sustainability and reduction of greenhouse gases emission that is now compelling. And it is, in my view, what the Green Deal is about. The Green Deal is about saying, look, politically also, we want to put sustainability, we want to put climate change, the fight against climate change first, on top of the agenda. And this also, I think, revolves around, let's say, sorting out potential legal conflicts that might arise, for instance, between internal market or competition, let's say, needs and priorities against sustainability and environmental priorities. So, well, I don't have, let's say, a silver bullet to resolve this conflict. But I think in the EU, of course, the European Commission would more and more strive to uphold measures that are justified on the grounds of, let's say, pursuing sustainability and achieving the Green Deal objectives as compared to internal market, let's say, objectives. Internationally, this is speaking, let's say, in the context of international trade, for example, this is quite a different game, I think. But in the EU, I think this is the way forward, as I see it from my perspective. I don't know if I answered to your question, but yeah, I will see in the future more and more, let's say, sustainability and environmental consideration, let's say, trumping competition considerations, as much as, of course, this is, let's say, feasible in a way to reconcile both.
Thank you very much, Matteo. You need to move on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Didn't want to monopolize, but thank you for your question, and a great debate ahead.
Yeah. No, I think actually it's about balancing. It's about balancing those values, but I also think that it will shift over time, and that sustainability become higher in the hierarchy compared to competition. I have presentation, but I will be rather brief because we have to catch up some time already. We are still at the second presentation. Yeah. Okay, I will briefly address some of the issues when you try to implement circular economy in public procurement practice, and I will also explain why I think that public procurement practice will change over time because some of the circularity principles will force us to do that. Okay. Yes, next. Okay, yeah, that's not the interesting part. But what is interesting, basically, is the picture, and the picture is taken in the old prison. And I think the old prison is a very nice building because it's probably an example of circularity, as it was a prison. Yeah, it's an old prison, but nowadays it's used as the law faculty. And also, if you during the break, you should walk a little bit and look at the cells, because you can still see the cells where the prisoners were retained. Actually, now you will see that in the cells you will find students. Maybe less at this moment with COVID, but in normal circumstances, you will find students in the cells that are really studying very, very hard. I don't say it's actually the same, but you know, it's reuse. The building got another function, and this is some of the ideas that is behind the circular economy. Okay, next. Yeah, my presentation, as I said, I will try to bring it as short as possible. A short introduction, then the leverage of public procurement. You all know that, but anyway, I included it. And then some of the new models. But of course, my colleague will explain the first one and the product as a service more intensively, but I will just mention it and bring you the headlines, and also public-private partnerships, which is one of my favorite topics. I will tell you some about it, and some concluding remarks. Thank you. Yeah, that's a movie. I included a movie. That's always very challenging from IT perspective, but it is there somewhere, one of the enable, I think.
We live in a world with finite materials.
We are throwing an awful lot of electronics, plastic food, carpets,
Clothing.
away. It's a waste of precious materials.
If we could build an economy that would use things rather than use them up, we could build a future that really could work in the long term.
You design the product in a way that
Can be taken apart. Once the consumer has finished using them,
you remanufacture it and give it out again. You can reduce your production costs hugely if applied correctly.
Instead of garments ending up in landfill.
Companies can repurpose it, reuse it, making profit out of their waste.
We take some resources from nature and bring it back in the form of nutrients.
It's very much a natural cycle.
We use 70% less water than conventional agricultural methods. Our packaging is not a waste, it's something that you can consume and need to.
We redesign everyday products to make them fully recyclable. We farm as close to nature as is possible.
the H&M Group has set ambitious targets to use 100% sustainably sourced materials.
There is a lot of conversation about not buying clothes, but different models where you can rent clothing.
We develop fully modular headphones that we offer on a subscription basis.
The circular economy itself is inevitable in my opinion.
It's not one fix. It's about the entire system being redesigned.
This is, to me, the only way to fight climate change, to fight pollution, to fight waste.
This is a business model that stacks up.
Global companies cannot survive in the future without transitioning towards a circular economy. That is a really exciting future.
Yes, that was it. Now, basically, this is the challenge. This is what we have to implement in public procurement. And that's not really self-evident. That is what I want to explain. Yeah, the next slide. So if you look at traditional public procurement contracts, public contracts, it's basically, yeah, it's the linear economy. Next slide, please. So this is what we are buying. This is what we are building. And this is the result at the end of the life, what you saw also in the movie. Next. Now, of course, public procurement can change that to some extent, because you all know 13 to 15% of the GDP is spent on public contracts. So there is a huge leverage, a huge purchasing power. And with this purchasing power, the government can really support businesses in the transition towards a circular economy. Government can also act as a launching customer to buy new products, new services. Governments can also use this purchasing power to stimulate innovation, creation of new products. Also to leverage the transformation, as I explained, and to promote and stimulate the development of new business models, because as we saw in the movie, that is what actually is needed. Next. Now, of course, the idea is to use the materials as efficiently as possible to reduce the pressure on the planet. And how do we do that? Well, basically, we need to have the situation that products are repaired, so that lifespan of products is extended. Products need to be redesigned. This was also explained. The production process needs to be changed so that fewer materials are needed. And people need to share products so that there are less products and that they are used in a more efficient and economic way. And then the materials need to be reused so that the waste will also be reduced and the new materials will be less, new raw materials will be less needed. Next. And eventually also, if we transform to that idea, even financial savings could be possible in the end, because at the moment we are actually not paying the real price. When we are buying products, we are buying a price, but we are not paying the price. Next. Now, how to implement this in public procurement and public procurement practice? Well, of course, what we can do is we can include some circular principles, circular ideas in the tender documentation. For example, we can include a minimum recycling rate, which is happening at the moment in some of the tender documents. We can include a modularity rate, which can help to stimulate that products are made of components, and if one component is broke, you can replace it by another component, so that in the end the lifetime of the product is prolonged. So that's an idea. We can implement clauses that really tries to make the producer responsible for a longer period. So that's all possible, but it's not very easy. Anyway, we need to move from practices, away from practices such as the sealed for life situation. You all know that, like with the smartphones, when the battery is broke, you can throw away the whole thing because you cannot replace it. So we need to move away from that. Next. So facilitate change in purpose. Reuse new users, or maybe the same users with an extended lifespan, or maybe we need to introduce clauses that things will be refurbished after a specific period, or that the elements, the components will be used in other products. And these are the things we need to integrate in the tender documentation. But of course, this is actually very, very challenging. It requires a careful drafting and a lot of knowledge to do so. And also, you can put it in the tender documentation, but you need to monitor the contract, because they can promise you the world, but eventually they also have to do it and you have to check it. And that's not all, because also at the end of the contract and the end of life management, which might be a clause, you need to check that. It's not only the monitoring during the term of the contract, but also at the end. You need to be very careful with that. And so that's actually a huge challenge. Next. And so there are some models that can facilitate, speed up this process. And those are, I think there are two models that are very interesting. The first one is the product as a service model, and it will be explained furthermore in a lot of detail. And then the public-private partnership model, but in an adapted way. Next. Now, you all know the product as a service model. We know that it's like, you know, when I was young, we had music on LPs. Yeah, and the tapes, and we also had music on tapes, and then later on it became CDs, and then yeah, nowadays we have Spotify and other services. The movie is the same. We had tapes, we had DVDs. Nowadays we have the streaming like Disney and stuff like that. But it's also when you look at mobility, well, we all used to buy a bike. Nowadays, if we want a step or a bike, yeah, we just take a subscription and we basically rent it for some time and we share also the use of it. So things are actually changing, and not only in those sectors, but also in other sectors. For example, in asset-related sectors like the lighting in a room. You see contracts where traditional vendors, traditional producers are moving away from their traditional model into a service model. And you have, for example, the LAS, lighting as a service. And if you take an airplane in the Netherlands, in Schiphol, look at the lighting, it's basically rented. So there is a company that installed the lighting, has a long-term contract. They are charging monthly fees for the illumination of the terminal. So they did not buy the bulbs, but they actually are buying a service on a subscription base, and where they are paying for the service they receive. Next. And then, of course, in these models, it's not the government, contracting authority that is buying all the stuff. Well, they are not investing, actually. It's the private partner, the vendor, the developer that is investing, and he makes available a service. But we need to be very careful also with the PaaS, the product as a service model, because it does not necessarily lead to circularity. So that's the danger. Also, in those cases, in the tender documentation, we need to include clauses, and I included an example. For example, we can state that the guaranteed reuse of the maximum number of lighting components need to be like this or that. So even in the PaaS model, we do not necessarily end up with a fully circular model. We need to include additional clauses to safeguard all elements of the circular economy. But anyway, the model in itself is also already a huge step towards more circularity. Next. Yeah, I have some slides, some references, but you can get them later. Next. And then the PPP model, the public-private partnerships. It's very similar to the product as a service model, but this time it relates not to products, not to bulbs, or not to a bike or a step or maybe music, but this time it relates to infrastructure, like complicated buildings, like a school, like an airport, like a road, like whatever you can imagine, but really large assets, infrastructure related. And how does that work? Well, it's not like a subscription model, but it's actually a situation where you lease or where you rent the infrastructure. So a private party is providing you a public asset and related services, and he will bear actually a lot of the risks that are associated with the construction, the maintenance, the delivery, even the finance of this infrastructure, of this asset, and the remuneration, what you are paying for, is actually linked to performance. So that's a traditional public-private partnership. and the private party actually designs, builds, finance an asset, and provide maintenance services under a long-term agreement. And there are a lot of examples of that. Once again, it's not necessarily circular, but you can make it, you can transform it into a more circular business model. We have a very famous example of a public-private partnership. You all know it. When you go to Paris, you see the Tour d'Eiffel. Well, the Tour d'Eiffel basically is a public-private partnership. It was built, it was designed by Gustave Eiffel, by his company. They designed it, they built it, they maintained it, and they exploited it for a period, a long-term period. And by charging income and by exploiting the restaurants, he was able to recoup his investments and made some profit out of it. That's basically a PPP. Next. Now, there are two models in PPPs, availability-based mechanism and a revenue-based mechanism. In an availability-based mechanism, the government is actually paying for the service. And in the revenue-based model, like the Tour d'Eiffel, it's actually the end users that are paying. That's the main difference. Next. Now, as I told you, you can turn PPP models into something rather circular. And this is, well, this is a Dutch example, but it's a very fascinating example. Or it's fascinating, maybe not for you, but I find it very fascinating. It's basically a court in the Netherlands. And it is, well, it was a temporary court because there was some renovation of the main court and they needed a temporary building. You can say, oh yeah, they could maybe put containers or something, but yeah, they really wanted a normal building or a more normal building. So they tendered a contract. And so they put a contract in the market, actually a design, build, maintain, and remove contract, a 6-year term contract. And the idea was to focus on the maximum residual value of this property. So the private partner had to propose, had to make an offer where the focus was on the residual value and also on the reuse of the building. So they had to construct, they had to design and construct a building that could be removed and reused after 6 years. And that is what actually happened. You see a picture. It's quite a nice building. It looks like a normal building. It is a normal building, but it's a circular building. So they designed it basically like Lego. It's a kit of small parts, and they assembled it on the spot, and it's very easy to disassemble. Well, that's what they told everybody. We'll see next year, because next year they will have to remove it and rebuild it on another place. So it was designed as a kit of parts, and the design was very smart. And also the use of materials were very smart, modular materials, so materials you can reuse in a very easy way without breaking too much of it. What is also interesting, it's a 6-year contract. So it was not only the assembly, the design, but also the removal, the reassembly is included. So basically, as a government, you can monitor the end of life because it's part of the contract. And it will be, they are at the moment preparing the removal. It will be used on another site for a different purpose. So actually, it's a PPP, a very interesting PPP. But it has a lot of features related to the circular economy. Next. So some concluding remarks. I think public procurement is an important leverage for circular economy and for sustainable public procurement in general. It's very, very challenging to implement it, especially in relation to the tender documents and the drafting. But I think there are some models like PAS and PPP that can help you. But of course, this implies, as you saw, this implies a shift from the transactional public contracts and public procurement, like you buy something, it's yours, and then you buy something new or you maintain it, to a relational model where you have long-term contracts where the roles are also changing bit. Of course, also these models are rather complicated. You need expertise, you need to manage risk, you need to manage the procurement. And then, of course, we come to the end, and that is basically the value of collaboration and also transfer of knowledge. And so networking and training. And that is what we are trying to do also with the SAPIENS network. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions from the chat.
Okay, then I stay.
Do you see a problem if the contracting authority would include requirement in the tender that the products that they buy would need to be repairable?
Yeah, that's one of the things you should do. But of course, in many cases, it means that companies have to develop new products, because nowadays we have a lot of products that are just impossible to repair or where it is very expensive. And that was when I said, we are not paying the actual price of a lot of the products we are buying. So that's already one element to answer this question.
How could the furniture use clause be introduced, not be restrictive, and how will the contractual clause to follow this aspect be correlated?
Yeah, okay. Well, how can it be included? Yeah, well, first of all, it needs careful drafting. And the second, there are examples. For example, in the Antwerp Management School, where I teach administrative law and public-private partnerships, all the furniture is actually reusable. Yeah. You know that? And from time to time, they even replace the furniture with other furniture from other companies. So you can choose, if you say, oh, I want a new chair, it's possible. They give you another chair. It's not a new one. It's a chair they took from another company. So it is actually possible. But what you do need is, you need, as I explained, you need to step away from the transactional model where you buy something and then it's yours. You need to move on to a service-related model where the contract has a long term, and where actually you have a relational situation.
Okay, one more question from Aline for the slide. With the light sources, practically the guarantee will be a statement on your own responsibility. Is it enough?
I don't know if it's your own responsibility. Well, first of all, the private partner will have a contract, so he's legally obliged to do what the contract states. Second of all, we have the contracting authority. Of course, they also have a responsibility, but of course, with the contracting authority, you also have the societal responsibility, because it's a government and it has to act in the public interest. So there is not only maybe the legal and the international treaties that oblige you to do some things, but as a government, we have, I think, the obligation, moral obligation, to act in the public interest. And acting in the public interest is also what Matteo explained, is trying to change things for the better. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Here, please.
My question is just technical. I wanted to ask you if public-private partnership always fell under the definition of public contracts, and if not, in which situations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have written books about that question, but to be real short, a PPP is like 90% of the time qualified as a public contract, but it's a complicated public contract, and in some cases, it's a concession, but yeah, concession, it looks like a public contract, so it's quite similar. It's another directive, but basically the ideas behind it are the same. So the answer is yes. I don't know many. Well, theoretically, it's possible to structure a PPP without without the fact that public procurement or the concession regulation applies, but you do not see that many times. So I think maybe 95% of the cases, it's public procurement or concession procurement related. They don't hear you, yeah.
This can be a bit tricky in terms of environmental and sustainability concerns, because I think that the concession directive is not as protective as the public sector directive in the terms, right?
The concessions directive is more about principles, but actually also related to the environment and the public procurement directive, it's also about principles. So I don't think there are many differences. It's the technical details in the procurement directive are very specific. There are less in the concessions directive. But if you look at the principles, I think it's the same. And that's also the point of view of the European Commission. To my knowledge, that actually the concessions directive contains the principles of the public procurement directive.
Included on 18.2.
That I should check, but I think to some extent it's included.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, how are human rights being integrated or considered into the circular economy? Because if I think about social aspect, I think it's just essential to boost this transition to circular economy into terms of if you make a bigger or a higher standard of working conditions in the electronics industry, for instance, you know, devices would go, the prices would go up, and that would be, you know, being disincentivizing the constant purchasing of or the increased purchases of electronics if we think of Apple and Foxconn, for instance. So how is it being addressed, and or are there any examples of, you know, human rights consideration or integration into the circular economy?
It's not really related to my presentation, I suppose, but I can give you an answer anyway because I'm here, so I can answer. Well, when you look at public contracts and at tender documents, especially social elements are included more and more. And if you look at the social considerations, the human rights perspective is integrated. So you don't see that very often in the circular procurement as such, but you do see it in the social responsibility, the social and environmental considerations that are integrated in public contracts. And not only in the public contracts, but you also see it in the private sector. For example, if some of the, I think it's the same in other countries, but if you look at, for example, some of the Belgian supermarkets, they are really trying to get a grip on the chain to improve the conditions along the chain. And I think that is really crucial. That's really crucial to protect and to implement human rights in all aspects of the chain. Okay, I think we need to break because otherwise our program will end up in a mess because we have a Marta. Okay.
No, that's fine. I will just be very brief. Maybe just someone can reflect on that later today. Can you hear me, just to double check?
Yeah, we hear you, Marta.
Awesome. Well, good morning, first and foremost. Sorry not to be with you all. I hope you enjoy yourself. My question is related to this conversation about circularity when it comes to repairability, for example. My question was mainly, Steve, connected to the notion, if I know that, for example, there are only 2 companies that can provide whatever I buy that is repairable, and the others can provide also phones or chairs, etc., but they are not repairable. So this goes back to Natalia's earlier question of sustainability versus competitions. Is that a potentially issue of narrowing artificially competition to extent that we favoring some companies than others, even that is an objective requirement? And the second part of that question is also, you referred a couple of times to this need for more relationship-like approach rather than transaction-like approach. So in a similar theme, is there a problem if we, for example, narrow down within our tenders requirement by introducing a requirement of short supply chain? Is that potentially, again, discriminatory? I would be very keen to hear today a little bit about it. If there's not a chance now, maybe later on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Marta, thank you very much for your question. It's an interesting question, and we can have a long debate on that. So we actually don't have time. today, but I think the example that you give, if there are two suppliers, then I think there is still competition. So I'm fine with that. The question becomes more problematic if there is only one supplier, and that does happen. It does happen in practice. I have some cases really related to that in practice, and then you have litigation. But actually, my point of view is always then, if there is only one, and if it is not intentional, but if you have objective reasons to include that specification, if you can explain it, then I think it's up to the market to transform itself, because competition is possible if some of the companies change their business and enter into the market. And eventually, I think that is what will happen. So I think it's, we don't have questions, time for questions anymore, but no questions. We need to move on. If you want to have discussions, we can do that during the lunch yeah, okay. We need to move on. I think we have a short break. You can stretch. Yeah, we have a break? No break. Sorry, no break. But you can stand up and then stretch your legs a little bit, so that we have a movie now, actually.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation. I am very sorry that I cannot be with you today due to traveling.
Yeah, so Bogdana made a movie, 20 minutes, and then afterwards we have our last.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation. I am very sorry that I cannot be with you today due to traveling, but I hope to see all of you in the afternoon. My presentation hopefully falls within the overall topic of this morning workshop, namely circular economy. I will be focusing, however, on the concept of circular cities, which is a little bit more specific. And I'm going to address a little bit more in depth the idea of municipality-led efforts towards circularity. Just a couple of words about my background so that you know where I'm coming from in terms of my knowledge and expertise regarding sustainability and circularity. My background is in public administration and urban planning and urban sociology. There is some EU law and administrative law in the mix. However, it's limited. I have been interested in sustainability and sustainability related topics for a long time, 10, 15 years. My PhD was in urban sprawl, described as an unsustainable land pattern. Then I continued at postdoc level with the same aspects pertaining to urban sustainability. I focus more specifically on sustainability metrics at city level. Then I moved towards sustainability in public procurement, and more recently I focused on how universities report sustainability indicators. Right now, I think I can say that my research focuses on smart city, innovation and resilience in cities, life cycle thinking in public procurement, SDGs monitoring, and metrics at local level. So I've been trying to integrate somehow my research interest for sustainability and more specifically urban sustainability with some issues that are of interest at EU level and EU law. For today, as I mentioned before, I will try to address the circularity issue at city level. And I want to point out that we are not just talking about circular economy in cities. This is because I'm not just an urban planner, but also because there is a growing body of literature on circular economy. Sometimes it is placed in cities, but there is considerable less information on circular cities. And I'm trying to discuss why cities are the appropriate level where efforts and initiatives regarding the transition towards circularity should be concentrated. And I am going to share with you a couple frameworks developed by various international organizations and entities and some selected best practices from cities around the world. I think that perhaps the best place to start the discussion on circular economy, circularity in general, is by talking about limits. And there is a very neat and interesting concept, though it has its critics, and that's called planetary boundaries. And this is a concept that basically refers to Earth system processes that contain environmental boundaries. It's fairly new, from 2009. It was proposed by a group of Earth system and environmental scientists from different universities, and they are basically defining a safe operating space for humanity. It's a concept that's meant to be used by the international community. It's based on scientific evidence that human actions have become the main driver of global environmental change. And they are splitting these planetary boundaries into different categories, and they are referring to risks which occur once this thresholds are crossed. And the interesting part is that there have been updates to this original study in 2015 and 2019. And as of 2019, at least this is what the scholars behind this model argue, is that 4 of the boundaries are currently crossed, and it's about climate change, loss of biosphere integrity, land system change, and other biogeochemical cycles. And this concept of planetary boundaries, it's closely related to another concept that has been around for several decades, that of carrying capacity. And this was also a concept employed in biology and ecology in the early stages of the sustainability debate. It pretty much refers to the same thing, that at a certain point, if we are not careful how we use resources, the planet is going to crash. Obviously, there is criticism pertaining to both the concept of carrying capacity and planetary boundaries, but I think it's useful to introduce the debate on the fact that we need to somehow change our way of looking to resources as being available for our consumption no matter what. This is just a neat diagram with the planetary boundaries, and to the left is the 2009, the original one, to the right is the updated version 2019. And having referred to these planetary boundaries or carrying capacity of the Earth, here it comes the more general concept of circular economy, which can be considered as a new economic paradigm. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this concept because this is not necessarily the main focus of my presentation. Again, it starts with the idea that I previously addressed, that the Earth's resources are finite, and that our current economic system has always considered these natural resources as free, cheap, and infinitely available. And a very cool concept as well is this Earth overshoot day, which basically refers to a specific month and day in a year when we exhaust our natural resources budget. And as you can see, this pretty much happens more recently around August. So we are basically consuming borrowed resources. 2020 and 2020 as the first year of the pandemic was a little bit better because it was end of August due to the lockdown. And this idea of consuming resources without necessarily caring where they come from is embedded in the concept of a linear economy, which basically it's the model take, make, and dispose. And this is what we are basically trying to correct with the circular economy model. We are basically trying to say that we are transitioning to a regenerative growth in which it is essential to keep resource consumption within planetary boundaries. And in a circular economy, the value of products, material, and resources is maintaining the economy for as long as possible, and the generation of waste is minimized. This is important because currently, if we look at some statistics about how we consume resources, numbers do not look very good. Both at global and EU level, approximately 11% of economy is circular, which means that around 90% of what we consume go to complete waste, and this causes a lot of problem with biodiversity and resource extraction. And these are basically very common diagrams or graphic representations of how the two economic paradigms, the linear model and the circular economy, are supposed to operate. If you are familiar at all with circular economy, you probably know that from the beginning, a lot of emphasis is placed on recycling and waste management. The interesting stuff right now is the fact that circular economy tends to get expanded to cover more areas. And I think that the quick formation of the EU Green Deal has generated a lot of buzz around this concept of circular economy. The main goal, of course, goes hand in hand with circular economy to transform the 27 EU countries from high carbon to low carbon economies. And more important, I think, to decouple economic growth from resource use. There are some more specific objectives for circular economy. And I think that it is important to take a look, if you have not seen this document, the new Circular Economy Action Plan, which was released in March 2020, which basically sets out very concrete actions on how to create circular business model, consumption patterns, and production processes in the EU. And if you take a look at the website of the European Commission, they try to break down the whole idea of circular economy into specific policies and tools and instruments. The specific policies are still pretty much focused on waste and recycling, raw material consumption. However, the tools and the instruments are a little bit more diverse, and I think this is where a lot of people from SAPIENS will find interesting things. For example, if you are connected in some way to construction construction materials, construction practices, you have at least one interesting instrument, which is levels, and which refers to sustainable buildings. Then if you focus more on directly on public procurement, you obviously have the green public procurement, but you can also integrate at various stages in the public procurement cycle, for example, the EU Eco Label or the Eco Management schemes. So my suggestion would be to take a look at this instrument because they are, I think, very applicable to a lot of the research you guys are doing. And with this, I am moving towards the focus of my presentation, which is circular economy in cities and circularity in cities. Of course, I think that the first question or issue to address is why would anybody consider cities as key in transition to a circular economy? Because so far when we discussed about circular economy, it didn't seem to be specifically linked to an urban system. Even the Commission's new Circular Economy Action Plan mentions very briefly in passing the role of cities in transition to circularity. Here, I think that in order to support my argument about the importance of city, the literature on sustainability is actually very critical, because this literature refers to cities as both the place, the locus where sustainability problems are generated, but also where they can be best addressed. And again, if you have a little bit of time and you're looking for a good reading, I would suggest that you take a look at this book by Benjamin Barber. It's a couple of years old, and it's called If Mayors Rule the World. Obviously, it's a metaphor. He's not seriously suggesting that mayors should be the leaders at global level. But I think he introduces the idea that cities share some unique qualities which make them better equipped to address some sustainability issues, most of them pertaining to climate change, and to address them at the local level. And he talks about very general qualities, something like pragmatism, civic trust, participation, indifference to borders and sovereignty, and democratic inclination for networking and creation of partnership, creativity, innovation, and cooperation. Again, very good book if you look to understand more in depth why local level might be better suited to address sustainability challenges. If we look more specifically at the literature on circular economy, there is the Circular City Funding Guide, which mainly identify two reasons why cities are important in the circular transition. And these two, as defined in the guide, are that cities can be seen as circular cradles and ecosystems in which circular solutions to pressing problems are initiated and nurtured. And also cities can be seen as circular catalysts at local levels. And over here, they mostly refers to strategic planning and city governments as facilitator or enablers of circular initiatives. This pretty much resonates in a more applied language to circularity, what Barber was saying a couple of years earlier. And I would suggest that you guys take a look at this diagram. because it refers to several, again, attributes that you find at city level in terms of density and scale of stakeholders, about the city's abilities to connect stakeholders, cities which can lead by example, autonomy in terms of regulating and incentivizing, cities being better equipped to communicate circular vision and strategies, and being better equipped to embed circular principles in city infrastructure and services. And I think that over here, pretty much you have all the reasons for examining cities as the place for putting circularity instruments in place. If we are trying to define more specifically what's a circular city, I'm telling you we are definitely having a challenge, because most definitions refer to circular economy and cities as the place where you can implement circular economy principles. However, I would say the definition by Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I think it's the more comprehensive. They are defining a circular city as the city which embeds the principles of a circular economy across all its functions, establishing an urban system that is regenerative, accessible, and abundant by design. The cities aim to eliminate the concept of waste, keep assets at their highest value at all times, and are enabled by digital technology. I think that why it's so complicated to put your finger on what a circular city is because all of a sudden you are transitioning from circular economy, which is more easy to understand because it deals with economic loops and cycles. You are moving towards cities which are very complicated urban ecosystems, where there are lots of functions and lots of dimensions which are interlinked. And a circular view applied to cities needs to look not just to consumption and recycling and all other actions, but it also needs to somehow incorporate the relationship between the components of the urban ecosystem. And I think that all of the readings that I've looked at, they stress the importance of effective governance with regard to transition to circularity, because related to governance is the idea that you need to put in place conditions and drivers which are required for the adoption of a circular economy thinking and for the establishment and acceleration of initiatives in this field. The whole idea of strategic visioning and planning is key in relation to effective governance. And there is another concept that I think perhaps some of you might be willing or interested to explore in your research, and this has to do with using cities or sections of cities, neighborhood districts as living labs. The whole approach to living labs, it's very much employed nowadays when you are trying to pilot and experiment or put in place various practices, and you can test them based on direct interaction and feedback from end users or beneficiaries if we are talking about public services. And there are some studies made on what are some conditions or prerequisites for moving towards circularity in cities. I decided to focus on these trees, which are being currently researched, investigated by the Stockholm Environment Institute. They have a project which is currently unfolding on this topic. And I will only address the first two because these are linked to the idea of circular city from a more conceptual standpoint. The third one, the fair transition, or how to mitigate unintended consequences of the transition to a circular economy. It's important, but it somewhat goes beyond the scope of our presentation today. So the first things that they consider are essential, and I think that they are right, refers to tools that help cities quantify their level of circularity and understand how all their systems interact. This is important because if somebody hires a consultant and tells him or her, please advise us on how we can move towards circularity, you need to understand where the baseline or the reference point for that system is. And then a practical definition for circularity. And over here, I am not referring to a simple definition. I am mostly referring to a framework that helps you understand what needs to be accomplished at city level. In terms of circularity metrics, I was extremely intrigued because I've told you that I have a little bit of background in sustainability metrics, and sustainability metrics are right now extremely technical and extremely complicated. However, they mostly focus on environmental indicators. I discovered that there are lots of circularity or circular economy metrics. However, very few of them focus on cities, and sometimes they don't even focus on circular economy. They focus on various aspects pertaining to broader concepts covered under sustainable development. You have a list of the most important ones on the slide. I just want to point out that I selected two metrics employed by cities. One is by London and the other one is by Amsterdam, because they are specifically designed for city level. And they have issues that are commonly encountered under a circular economy framework: consumption, municipal waste, material intensity, and carbon intensity indicators. However, they have a section that's defined like enabling metrics, and this is pretty much more or less process oriented. They want to go a little bit more specific and to look at what's happening at city level. And over here you have procurement included, you have demonstration projects, but you also have the relationship with research and development universities. Amsterdam, again, looks at value preservation. It looks at economic impact and ecological impact. And in a way, they try to emulate a sustainability framework by having dimensions: economic, environmental, and instead of social, they look at value preservation. What's missing from most of these frameworks is the boundary of the system. Very often they look at economic cycles and not necessarily how they are integrated within an urban system. The second thing I want to share with you is the framework for circularity in cities. This is something that I borrowed from a United Nations entity, and they identify 4 components: city assets, circular actions, circular city outputs, and circular city enablers. And if you go to this guide, a guide to circular cities, you can actually get very clear diagrams and very clear toolkits on how to conduct the understanding or the analysis of an urban system of a city from the perspective of circularity. And you have the diagram with the city assets and products. Then you have the circular actions, which are pretty clear: sharing, recycling, refurbishing, reusing, replacing, digitizing. And then you have the 3rd level, where you actually, by combining assets with actions, you have outputs. And then you have the city enablers, where a lot of what we are doing with public procurement and with other instruments falls under, because, for example, you have utilizing procurement as a lever for circularity. You also have public-private partnership. You have city innovation or circularity-related city innovation ecosystems, participation, and so on and so forth. So I think that if we are smart enough and we try to combine theoretical models which talk about gaps, things that need to be covered and developed in the future, with instruments that already exist, we can pretty much get a better understanding of how to apply circularity in cities. And the last slide I am going to, or the last aspect I am going to address with this last slide, has to do with selected case studies on circular municipal efforts. I was trying to decide which one would be more interesting for you guys, but in the end, I just decided to put the table of content. I think this material, you had it among your readings, and it's, I think, a very good inventory of what being achieved so far. These are cities with either citywide circular strategies for circular economy, circularity. And it's very interesting if you look to any of those. They range from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to some other countries at global level. You will see that generally a citywide strategy on circularity complements other efforts that are already in place, aiming at sustainability, aiming at zero emissions, aiming at other aspects that in one way or another are related to this struggle to be more sustainable at city level. Then you have more specific efforts which focus on a variety of specific things like urban refurbishment, urban procurement or public procurement in urban settings, on utilities, and obviously on civic waste, because this has pretty much been the standard topic in circular economy in cities. So go take a look. I am not going to hide from you that certain case studies are more difficult to understand why they are placed under the circular economy agenda. The ones where you really have to dig a little bit to understand why they are best practices for circularity, have to do mostly with soft actions like participatory governance, networking, knowledge sharing. Those are the most difficult ones to pin down, but I think that they are all interesting nonetheless. And I am going to end my presentation with saying that we can definitely see some hints, some indications that city circularity is growing in importance. However, there are still significant overlaps with sustainability, but also with other similar concepts, for example, with eco-cities. And I think that there are at least 3 questions that needs to be specifically addressed when looking at circularity in cities. First of all, what are the boundaries of a circular cities? Do we look at geographic or administrative boundaries, or are they far wider? Do we look at how economy or economic cycles take place? This is not clearly addressed, and I think this is a gap in the literature. Then, what are the aspects of circular economy that can be directly influenced by local government initiatives? This is an important point because in order to think globally and act locally, you need to be aware of what can be done by city governments. And also, I think that there needs to be a discussion about the importance of process indicators when measuring, assessing circularity in cities. This is pretty much my presentation. I really hope that there are no overlaps with the other speakers. If you have any questions or if you want to discuss with me more in depth any of the aspects that I addressed in my presentation, I am more than gladly to do it in the next days. See you soon, and thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.
Spare. Whoa. So. Michael Peters. Yeah. It's a nice white background, actually. Yeah. It's me. All right. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much for being here. So today's lecture will be about product service systems. And as Stephen also had a picture, I did one too. It's also in a very nice building, which has been repurposed. So this now, it used to be actually a former office, and now it's a co-working third place kind of thing. So yeah, we also reuse that one. I do some research, smart energy management, smart product service systems. That's the idea. We also have a research share at EMS, so at Antwerp Management School, concerning social value. It's not on here, so I have to adapt that one. And I also have a company, it's called LAMP. LAMP is an acronym for Life and Asset Management Using PropTech. So we're not developing PropTech, but we're using a lot of data in what we do. And we are also a CESCO, or we try to be CESCO, Circular Economy Service Company, which means that we actually try to make companies and products more circular in our way by transforming their products into services. So that's also the link towards my research and what I have done in the past and still doing for the future to be. Well, if you look at smart in this case really means it's about data. So it's about technology being used. It's not about how pretty it looks. Well, I have slides with a lot of text on them, so you can read it all afterwards. I'm not going to in every detail. I just want to tell you some stories from a practitioner's point of view. And then we have all the academic literature going on while on the background, actually. So PSS is offered as an integrated package of products and services with the aim to deliver an outcome, functionality, or systems ability. And so that's really the idea, is that, well, today product is dominant. And what we try to avoid is that dominance of the product and really look at what should be the result, the outcome of what you buy, what you're trying to do. And that's, well, in a nutshell, actually the big idea of the product service system. Well, some examples, some famous examples. I think at Rolls-Royce is the most famous, where you don't buy an engine anymore, but you buy trust. So you don't, well, actually pay for the engine, you pay for being able to use it and fly. That's what they are doing. Actually, during the pandemic, and that's also one of the pictures that well, shocked me most. You saw airplanes with no engines anymore, because they have the engine as a service. And the first thing airplane companies did was send back the engine. So they didn't have to pay for, well, using the engine anymore or having that in their custody. So, well, from a pandemic point of view, if you look at product service system, it's already proved that, well, during special times at least, you can recuperate a lot of money. So also Xerox and Enrico are very famous PSS examples. From literature, well, so you have the benefits internal of the company and externally, where you also see like the social impact, which is growing. It's a growing concern, how are services managed, but also how products manufactured, how in which kind of environment is the product fabricated, and all those kind of things. Where dematerialization is one of the big key points at the moment. How can we reduce the resources that are being used in manufacturing a product, but also during the lifetime? So we're really looking at the big cycle, like the whole life cycle costing idea. Just, well, the other ones are most important in the internal is the constant cash flow, and that we see with a lot of companies are really interested in, like, okay, today we have a business model, we have, well, temporary cash flows, but we really want to have them more stable. And that's one of the reasons they're willing to transform into, well, a service offering. Well, more customer loyalty, more bonding with the customer, but also having the ability to have the data, because most of the products are connected, and having the data to be able to adjust and optimize actually the products and the services they're offering. You have direct feedback from your customer, and that's for sure something that was lacking in the past. Well, barriers, lots of them. Well, mostly at the moment, if you really look at practice and not at academia, well, it's also somewhere on here. Well, it's money. It's the financial institutions that are not willing today to go with the business model. And that makes for very small companies, SMEs, that there's not really a possibility to go and transform. And the bigger companies are not really willing to transform yet, because for them it's really hard to go from a product setting into a service setting. It would mean a major investment, and that's why they're not, well, that happy to do that, although we see some changes over there. So now, where do we link? Because product service system as such isn't really linked towards a circular economy. It's just a business model. And it, well, there is literature and there's proof, there's been research that suggests that it could be a very good business model towards circular economy. And that's actually how we have to say it. But very important to keep in mind, it's also what Stephen already mentioned, there's no guarantee that because it's a product service system that you will be circular, and that for sure will not be the case. But if we look at the European Green Deal and we see some explanation, we see extended producer responsibility will be strengthened regarding the whole life cycle of products, as well as PPS, so PSS, product service systems, where producers keep the ownership of the product. That's really where we want to go. In my perspective, if you look at circular economy, you have to, well, take the responsibility and put it at the one supplying the product. And you just pay for the service because you don't want to own the product. You just want the result of the product. That's, well, in many cases, that's the case. And then you don't get into, well, all kind of legal stuff where you say, okay, but how do we have to describe and how do we have to, I don't know, get guarantees and whatever. Well, the guarantees, if it doesn't, well, give the result you want, you don't pay. That's a pretty easy contract, I think, but I could be wrong there. Of course, in practice, there's a huge problem, especially from the legal side. If we practice again, so we are actually doing a lot in real estate. So in real estate, well, we ran into tons of legal issues. Even most of them are insolvable, they say to us. So, so yeah, that's always a risk. Yeah? But again, I look at a room full of bright people solving that mystery. So, looking forward, that's clear. So, circular economy, 8 categories are prioritized. So, get the priority. Amongst them are food, transport and mobility, furniture, and building and construction products, which are also the ones I have some experience in, especially buildings and construction products, of course. So in PSS business models, producers remain bound to the product. So they don't necessarily keep ownership, but they are bound to the product in some way. We will explain on the next slide. Producers may, so it's not like a fact, but they may be responsible for the product maintenance, repair, or recycling. Producers may offer the product as a service in different forms, such as leasing, renting, shared use, and all other forms of legal constructions possible. But these are the main ones, I guess. Yeah, and because somebody is delivering a product and a result, and the other one is paying for that service, for that result, well, you get into what we hope will be a changing consumer pattern behavior. Because you have some social pressure, you also have some, okay, you can do this with the product and you cannot do that with the product. If it's your own, yeah, you do whatever you want. If you're in a relationship where you're using somebody else's product, well, there are rules and there are façon de faire, like how can you use it, what should you do? And that should already, well, make the behavior of the people more rational and more sustainable. Because in the end, this is not really a technical issue. It's not even a legal issue. It's a, well, it's a people issue. It's really a people business. And how do we actually change the idea and the behavior of people? Optimal use and reuse take environmental, economic, and social costs and benefits in account. If you look at, well, the definition of sustainability, it's always those three that come back, being the environmental, economic, and social cost. So always look at those three factors at the minimum, and you will already come a long way. That's for sure the idea. And then we have the three R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. It's the circularity, well, R's, but, well, being creative with English, the R's have already expanded into a letter, where R0, refuse, is like the goal, don't use it. And where recover is being seen like, okay, if you really need it and you can't do anything else, yeah, then recover the materials. But, well, everything in between is, well, it's a ladder. If you have some fantasy, you can see the ladder into the picture. And it's the ladder of sustainability. So always think about the R's, and somehow, well, it gives you a feeling about sustainability. Also in contracts, I see them in practice, and well, it's also being creative with English, I guess. But there's a huge there's a huge difference between repurposing and remanufacturing. And if you're not an English native, then is it the same? Is it what we mean? I guess that well, lawyers get trained into doing these mind tricks, but like just being a humble engineer, well, it becomes difficult. And then we typically start with defining all the terms. And then after 3 weeks of legal work, we stop doing that because everybody is annoyed, actually. So, and we end up in huge discussions on what does that actually all mean. So some common definitions are already prepared for you and copy-pastable. Well, there are high expectations. There are still expectations, to be clear, for the role of product service system in enabling the transition towards a circular economy, both in policy and practice. Arguments are made that product service systems have superior environmental performances compared to traditional business models, and that PSS lead to economic gains. Good. They all could do that, but that's not per se true. So that's something you really need to take into account, and especially from enforcing a contract. Enforcing contracts, that's the huge matter. How do you enforce that? How are you going to control that? How are you going to measure that? That's also why I myself, I'm looking at smart systems and smart product service systems, because we argue that everything needs to be connected in a digital way so that we can monitor everything and that we know the performance from data perspective. So that we can always say, okay, but we measured. Beforehand, we agreed on how we were going to measure, using which sensor, using which metric, using which KPI, whatever. And because of that connection and that digital connection and that all those IT stuff coming in, well, we can actually, there's no discussion. We agreed on 50 and it's 49, then it's not 50. So that's, well, that's something you need to do. And that's also where everything really gets nicely connected, like the technical part and the legal part and the IT stuff. And things get a bit cloudy to say. So can lead to significant environmental benefits, but also social and for sure economic. That's the one thing, of course, that was researched instantly. And we all found out that for sure there's revenue to be made. 3 big types of product service systems. The one being product oriented, and product oriented is, well, nothing more like I sell the product and additional services. That's actually brutally put how that works. And it's just like, okay, you buy a car and you get a maintenance contract on it. That's a product-oriented product service system. Maybe not really what we want to achieve, certainly not in the circular economy, as the problem is still the same, it just costs more, because you have the service add-on. Well, rationale behind it is that yeah, by having a maintenance contract and having more maintenance, you will optimally perform and have some impact on environmental stuff. So there's some arguments to be made, but that's not really where we want to go. Use-oriented services, well, the product ownership remains with the provider, so that becomes interesting. And the consumer gets access to the function of a product. The consumers dispose of the product for a time limited to its usage, and the producer is responsible for the maintenance and disposal of the product. So, well, you just use the product. So the name is well chosen, use-oriented services. But because of the ownership being with the provider, you are, from an enforcement point of view, from a circular economy point of view, more certain that some obligations are fulfilled, like, well, disposal, end of life. What are we doing with the materials? Is it recycled? All those kind of things. Where we want to go, in my opinion, is the result-oriented services. The client and provider agree on a result without predetermining the product involved. I'm going to give you light. And, well, it doesn't really matter which fixture I use or which lamp I use, as long as I give you the right lighting level, light, color, light, whatever, then there's no issue. Very special in result-oriented services. Every example I know started with the manufacturer of the products redefining his product. Like Schiphol, the famous example, the first thing they did was reinvent their fixture, because then it was, well, you could, it was more energy efficient, it was easier to maintain, it was easier to change the components. They already knew that most likely were going to break down, all those kind of things. So you could argue that, okay, if you know all these things, then why is that model not on the market? So, well, I have the same with a heating example, where we say, okay, we want heat as a service, and we get a brand new, shiny out of the R&D department, well, how do you say it, heater, with a lot of new cool features I never saw before. And that's all because actually the provider agrees on a result and not on the product as such. So, well, there are things to say from an innovation point of view, apparently, when somebody else is responsible for energy use and reusing and materials and all those kind of things. Well, some R&D needs to be done. So that's something we can only stimulate, of course. Product service systems today is not common at all. Mainly due to people don't understanding the concept. People are willing to have ownership. A lot of legal issues on whatever. Can I choose my energy supplier? Can I, what with accession, I think it's called in English, what with if it breaks down, what if there's a fire, what if, lots of what ifs. We covered some. We have 5 projects as in real estate for as a service in, well, going on right now, and more to come, we hope. But it's, well, it's not that trivial as you would think. And still we need to go there, because that's the only way we see that R&D is happening, that more socially, environmentally and economic products are coming onto the market, and that everybody takes the responsibility he needs to take. Because let's be honest, like private persons, well, it's all difficult to understand the technicalities already. So it's much more used like, okay, I pay for my heat and all the technical stuff. Well, that's for the specialists, the one who are actually producing the good. PSS, yeah, that's of course also something like product service systems started out as being really driven by sustainability. So if you look at the first papers in academia, it's really about making a sustainable business model, where we see that, well, especially the last decade, it's more about the economic benefits. So there's something going on where we need to steer back towards the sustainability thing, which will be okay. But having it purely as a business strategy, well, that will actually not be the goal. In the end, we won't achieve anything. Well, not anything, but okay. Not what we intend to do when it comes down to circular economy. Circular economy, well, in a nutshell, it's about resource use. How do we use and reuse resources? And what we want to achieve is net resource reduction. And what is actually the hardest thing to do in enforcement is confirm the actual displacement. So what happens after the end of life? They retrieve the product. What happens with that? Can I control that? Do I have the right to control that? How do I control that? All those kind of things. That's already very important. But also, you have the relative resource reduction, and then you have the absolute resource reduction. And what I'm hinting at is the rebound effect. And what's the rebound effect? Well, by making something less expensive, more people are going to use it, and that's not necessarily what you want to achieve. Imagine that you have to buy a plane before you can fly. Well, not that much people are able to buy a plane. But by saying, okay, you can use the service of flying, well, a lot of people get access to being able to fly, and a lot of people will start flying. And that's actually the rebound effect. And from a relative resource reduction, you can say, yeah, but I have used resources to construct a plane. And okay, now I'm utilizing it more because other people can also use and whatever. But absolute, and from an absolute resource perspective, yeah, you will use more fuel, you will have more air miles and whatever. So in total, well, it will be negative. You will have used more resources and you will have a higher environmental impact. We saw the same with photovoltaic panels. So putting photovoltaics on your roof, so you generate electricity, and people that were very careful about their electricity consumption just didn't care anymore. They were like, okay, it's free energy, so I'm going to use it, and they consumed more. So that's the rebound effect. And what we really need in the circular economy is the absolute resource reduction. That's what you want to go for. That's also what you want to do in your procurement phase, is that they guarantee not only relative resource reduction. The resources can be anything, energy, materials, even labor in some way. So, so you really want to go towards that absolute idea. Yeah, so a lot of promises and we guarantee nothing. So that's again, well, a reminder. What I want to show you, it's a very interesting paper actually, is a two-step framework for product service system to circular economy strategy, and especially again to absolute resource decoupling. That means that actually there's no more resources being used after implemented the product service systems, but the economic wealth will grow. And that's actually what we try to do there. And it's a nice picture. I will go through it step by step, but I will do this very quickly. But you can read most of it. I also nicely referenced the paper, and you should really read it. It's perfect. What you see is the product service systems on top. Then you see step one, relative resource reduction, going towards a circular economy strategy. And then the end goal is actually the absolute resource decoupling. And that's actually what we try to do there. So from a product service system, we achieve relative resource reduction. And then we say, okay, we want to go to circular economy. So absolute resource decoupling is what we want to achieve. You see on the left-hand side, I'm just going to do it like this, the PSS strategies. So just giving you some ideas on how to achieve actually the product service system. PSS enablers of resource reduction. How is it actually going to make resources usage more efficient, because the product lives longer, because it's intensified from a usage perspective, so we don't need to remake a new one or have it repaired. Product substitution, very popular right now. Can't we do things virtually? Do we need the product in real life? Can't we do it virtually somehow? All the metaverse idea is getting into that area. And then operational efficiency, of course, and make it as efficient as possible. Resource reduction aims, it's really about, reduce the need for producing a product for product use. If you don't have to use it, that's still the best thing to do. And displace more resource-intensive systems into other ones. And that's actually, so we have the product service system. We have different strategies to offer. What's the offering we make? What are we trying to do with those offerings? Well, we're trying to enable the resource reduction, being operational efficiency, product longevity. I don't know, it's how long the product will be active. Intensified product usage and product system substitution. And what are we trying to do? Well, that's reducing the resource need relatively. And then we come into step two. Step two, we are going to look at absolute resource decoupling. How are we going to go there? Well, we actually ensure net resource reduction. So we look at the product and we are going to measure if effectively we are using less resources. And again, energy can be a resource. Avoid burden shifting between life cycle stages. It's very easy to say, okay, we're going to use less material during production, and then it's also much better end of life. But then, the usability of the system gets a lot shorter, so you have to change the system more often. Well, and then you have just shifted burden from production actually to the life or the use stage. So always look at the full life cycle. Especially when I see greenwashing today or social washing or whatever, it's not always intentional, I guess, but it's really because the life cycle is just, we just look at one part of the cycle. We don't look at the whole thing, and that's where things go wrong. Well, and mitigate rebound effects to the fullest extent. Look at those and see that you are not actually, shifting towards somewhere else. And unintendedly being responsible for a whole new use and use of resources. So that's actually what I'm trying to do in the next 40 slides. So you see, I really did my copy pasting well. Okay, so just some last reminders. I'm going to finish. How to stimulate product service system pricing. Virgin materials and new products should be more expensive. Today, in most cases, even, it's easier to buy a new thing than buying something second-hand or whatever. And the one thing that's really, really responsible for that is labor cost. Because labor cost is too high. The handling of second-hand materials or whatever hand materials is just too heavily taxed. And it's easier to just buy virgin materials from low-pay countries, even with transportation, than doing it ourselves. So that's really something I would plea for. Tax deduction, why not? If we're doing something, why not reduce taxes? But especially on labor again. It's really labor that's killing us. Revising accounting standards. It's a bit technical, but you have the depreciation of an asset. And actually, the depreciation, I don't have another word for that one, to zero, and standard solvency calculation make it hard for product service systems. Because, you put it on your balance, you just, depreciate it to zero, and that's not really right. You should have some other way of dealing with that one, especially if you go to solvency criteria and all those things. Well, a dedicated taxonomy for sure is necessary. to know and define the terms. I'm very grateful actually, because every presentation we had so far, well, used more or less the same definitions. So at least we are on one page for that one. But well, we need some more big world deals on that one. So a taxonomy specifically for services would be very nice. Support of financial system. It's really the big hurdle today to take. Reducing financial risk. And that's especially for SMEs. So SMEs are actually willing and much more able to transform their product into services, also really wanting to do that, but can't or won't take the financial risk. And that's also where public procurement comes in. So Steven said between 13 and 15%. So an engineer says it's 14%. Well, public procurement is very important in that one, but lower the standards. A lot of tenders are starting with, yeah, you need to be a company of at least 50 people or have a revenue of 5 million euros or you cannot participate. Then it starts, and then already you're in trouble. So you have to find a partner. It has to be a big one. And yeah, then things just don't work out anymore. So let's do something about that one. And don't forget that innovation is also a very important thing. Especially if you want to go to circular economy with a product service strategy. Lifecycle costing, take environmental and social into account. Don't forget the social part. We see a lot of, it's about energy and it's about materials. We as a company, as LAMP, we really focus on social because that's really underestimated. And we think that in the future, that will be the real challenge, not the environmental part. Well, also, of course. Change mindset and behavior. Today, it's unknown. It's hard to explain as a business model. We come from ownership. We are used to think in usage and in outcomes. Well, even if you ask, so you want to buy a washing machine, but how many times do you wash? And how frequent would you use a washing machine? Well, it's very hard to answer because we just do it. We don't think about it. So if you start thinking about it, then, well, things get complicated. And complication leads to a trust issue. Yeah, valuation, of course. How do we value services? How do we value products that enable more services than others? How do we take into account real options? Then it's there, of course. Well, I've done quite some work on that in my PhD. So, and how do you value that? Is a product that enables one service, does it have the same price as a product that, well, enables multiple services? So how are you going to price a product? Do you need to price a product? Very good questions. Digitalization. If one thing will help circular economy, it will be digitalization, because we can really change a lot, well, replace or displace, whatever you want, a lot of services into a digital world, where well, Spotify is the best example. We used to have CDs. LPs I didn't know, but CDs I have known. Well, it's a lot of resources, a lot of material, plastic casing and whatever. And now it's just Spotify. And it's the same service, even better. It's more easy, it's easier, it's cheaper and whatever. And there's no resources involved. So that is really enabling circular economy going to digitalization. So some references, the two main papers that you actually should read is this one on the circular business models, product service systems on the way to circular economy. And then this one, product service systems for a circular economy, the route to decoupling economic growth from resource consumption. That are really two main papers I found myself very interesting if it's about the combination of PSS and circular economy. If any questions remain, I'm always at your disposal. And that's it for now.
Excellent. We don't have time for questions, unfortunately, but our speaker is here, so